Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The Central Brew Cafe was quiet on Tuesday morning, bathed in soft sunlight streaming through the large bay windows. The scent of freshly ground coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the aroma of warm croissants and muffins. Customers sat at their tables, immersed in newspapers or laptops. Among them, Richard Thompson, director of Thompson Industries, a man in his 50s in an impeccable suit, watched the activity with a critical eye. He liked to monitor everything around him, even the ordinary neighborhood cafe. Jasmine Carter entered at that moment. Her calm, elegant demeanor contrasted with the nervousness Richard perceived, though that was entirely in his distorted imagination. Her neatly tied hair, crisp gray suit, and leather handbag spoke of a confident woman, but in his eyes, she was out of place. As Jasmine walked up to the counter, a minor mishap occurred. Her bag clumsily caught a cup that tipped onto the countertop. The liquid spilled onto the wood, lightly splashing the tray behind her. Richard jumped to his feet, red with anger. He pointed at Jasmine in mock indignation. "What are you doing here? You have no right to wreak havoc in my establishment," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with rage and contempt. Jasmine looked up, surprised and embarrassed. She was about to apologize, but before she could speak, Richard had already pulled out his phone. Within seconds, he had called the police, reporting a disruptive customer and implying that the situation was suspicious. A few minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They watched Jasmine neutrally, waiting to understand the situation. She then calmly opened her wallet and took out her business card. "District Attorney, Jefferson County Office," she said, her voice calm but firm. Silence fell like a knife in the cafe. The police officers exchanged a quick, serious look. Richard, however, remained frozen, his face falling in surprise and embarrassment. His arrogance and racism had just been brutally confronted by the legal authority embodied by Jasmine. Little did he know that this moment, though brief and seemingly innocuous, would trigger a series of events that would turn his life upside down and publicly expose his prejudices. The lesson in justice had just begun. After the shock of the prologue, Richard Thompson remained frozen behind his counter. His hands were shaking slightly, a contrast to the confident air he liked to project. Jasmine Carter, impassive, put her card back in her wallet and turned to the police officers. "I'm here for my coffee," she said calmly. "There's no disturbance on my part." The officers nodded, clearly aware that Richard had acted out of prejudice rather than necessity. One of them turned to him. "Mr. Thompson, I don't think there's any need to intervene. The situation is resolved." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His eyes flashed with frustration and humiliation. Never before had he been confronted like this by someone who, with a simple card, could neutralize his authority. Jasmine paid for her coffee and walked away calmly, leaving behind a red-faced Richard and an eerie atmosphere in the cafe. The customers whispered, some casting sympathetic glances at the young prosecutor. Once the door closed behind her, Richard turned to his secretary, shaking with suppressed rage. "Prepare the report. I want to know who this woman is," he ordered, his voice dry. "I want everything on her." His secretary nodded, a little hesitantly. She knew her boss's character and knew that this curiosity wasn't motivated by mere politeness. This was the first time Richard had seen his superiority challenged in public, and he wasn't about to let it go. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued her day as if nothing had happened. Her mind was already focused on her legal affairs, the urgent cases she was working on. But she still had no idea that this incident, seemingly insignificant to many, would become the catalyst for a confrontation that would expose the racism and arrogance of a powerful man. Outside the cafe, the sun was shining, but an invisible storm was beginning to gather, and Richard Thompson would soon discover that justice could strike in unexpected and relentless ways. After the incident at the cafe, Richard Thompson couldn't think about anything else. His bruised ego and anger were boiling inside him. This woman, Jasmine Carter, had dared to contradict him, and worse, she had humiliated him in front of his employees and customers. For Richard, this was unthinkable. Back in his office, he ordered his secretary to gather everything on Jasmine, her address, her work history, her acquaintances. "I want to know everything about her," he repeated, his voice vibrating with suppressed rage. His secretary, uneasy, politely reminded him. "Mr. Thompson, she's just a client. Maybe you should let it go." But Richard wasn't listening. For him, this wasn't just an incident, it was a matter of prestige and control. He spent hours searching for information, contacting acquaintances around the city, searching public and private databases. Each discovery reinforced his resentment. Jasmine was competent, respected, and far above anything he could have imagined. Meanwhile, Jasmine, completely oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, continued her busy day in court. She was due for several important hearings and had to defend sensitive cases. She juggled calls, documents, and meetings, unaware that someone was plotting her downfall simply because she had been herself. Later that day, Richard Thompson decided to take the next step. He called his lawyers to discuss legal ways to protect his reputation. His intentions were clear: to pressure, intimidate, and ensure that this woman would never cause him any more embarrassment. But what he didn't know was that Jasmine wasn't just a skilled prosecutor, she knew the legal system inside and out and was unafraid to face someone like him. The chapter ends with a striking contrast: Richard, locked in his office, schemes in the shadows, while Jasmine, unaware, continues her day with determination and dignity. The inevitable confrontation draws closer, and everyone moves toward what could well be a monumental clash. 2 days later, the city's apparent calm was deceptive. Richard Thompson had now turned his resentment into obsession. He knew Jasmine Carter had an impeccable reputation, but he believed he could outshine her with money, influence, and connections. That morning, Richard went to court under the pretext of settling a case for his company. His real goal: to meet Jasmine and try to unsettle her. When he saw her familiar face in the lobby, his blood boiled. She was talking with a colleague, smiling and focused, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her. He stepped forward, imposing his presence, and stood in front of her. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone fake and polite, but laden with tension. "I think we had a little misunderstanding the other day." Jasmine looked up, her face impassive. She immediately recognized the man from the cafe, but her expression remained neutral. "Mr. Thompson," she replied calmly. "Yes, I remember very well. And I'm certain it didn't require police intervention." Richard smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. "Oh, I don't mean to offend you. But you understand, some details need to be clarified." Before he could continue, a young lawyer from Jasmine's office approached, giving Richard a suspicious look. Jasmine gave him a discreet signal to step back. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied firmly. "If you have a formal complaint, I advise you to submit it through legal channels." Richard's cheeks flushed. He had underestimated her courage and her ability to fight back. And above all, he couldn't bear to feel helpless in front of someone he considered inferior. This first confrontation left Richard furious and humiliated in the courtroom. He understood one thing: Jasmine Carter was not an easy victim. And in his mind, the game had just begun. Meanwhile, Jasmine, aware of the barely veiled hostility, remained focused. She knew this type of man wouldn't back down easily, but she was prepared. Her career, her dignity, and her determination to uphold justice were far more powerful weapons than fear or intimidation. After their courtroom confrontation, Richard Thompson could think of nothing else. His failure to intimidate Jasmine Carter haunted him. He decided he wouldn't settle for mere threats, he would use all his influence to make her life difficult. The next day, he summoned his lawyers and closest advisors. "I want everything related to Mrs. Carter monitored," he ordered, his hands gripping the desk. "I want to know where she goes, who she meets, and I want her to feel the weight of my attention." His advisors, uneasy but loyal, nodded. Richard knew he could use his position in the city to put pressure on business partners, suppliers, and even some influential members of the justice system. But he ignored a crucial truth: Jasmine was more than just a prosecutor. She knew the system inside and out and knew how to spot the maneuvers of this type of man. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued her professional routine. Files piled up, hearings followed one after the other, and she began to hear whispers. Some documents were slow to arrive, some business contacts were becoming strangely distant. She frowned, sensing an invisible but persistent tension. What she didn't know yet was that Richard had already begun manipulating some of the files in her office and setting up little pitfalls to test her reactions. Every obstacle she encountered was calculated, designed to make her doubt and put her in difficulty. But Jasmine wasn't one to be intimidated. Every obstacle strengthened her resolve. She began analyzing her problems with methodical precision, searching for the causes of these irregularities and preparing to respond strategically. The chapter ends with a contrast: Richard, in his luxurious office, smiling arrogantly, thinking he has the situation under control, and Jasmine, in her files, focused and silently ready to transform this power struggle into a lesson in humility for the one who had believed he could dominate her. A few days later, Jasmine Carter began to see a pattern behind the mysterious obstacles that were holding her back. Files were slow to arrive, contacts were hesitant to respond, and quiet rumors were circulating around her office. She quickly realized it was a deliberate scheme. Rather than panic, she decided to adopt a subtle and effective strategy. Her first action was to strengthen her documentation and secure all her communications. Every email, every call, and every document was scrutinized. She knew that Richard Thompson could not ignore the legality of her actions if she had solid evidence. She then began analyzing Richard's network of influence. Using her legal knowledge and contacts in the legal community, she quickly identified gaps in his alliances and individuals who might be susceptible to evidence of abusive or discriminatory behavior. One morning, as Richard was enjoying his anticipated victory in his office, Jasmine knocked on his office door with a bulky file. "Mr. Thompson," she said calmly, her face calm but determined. "It seems that some information is circulating in a irregular manner regarding my files. I have compiled all the necessary evidence." Richard frowned, surprised by her audacity. He'd expected her to panic or try to excuse herself, not retaliate with such mastery. "What do you mean?" he asked in a tone that betrayed his nervousness. Jasmine placed the file on her desk and left it open at a specific page. Copies of communications, evidence of manipulation and pressure on colleagues, were clearly visible. Richard's every action had been documented, every maneuver traced. "You attempted to interfere with my duties as prosecutor. These actions are not only immoral, they are illegal," she said firmly. "I advise you to seriously consider the consequences before acting again." Richard, for the first time in a long time, felt his control slipping away. Arrogance gave way to palpable fear. Jasmine wasn't just ready to defend herself, she was ready to expose her actions to the light of the law and the public. This chapter ends with palpable tension. Richard realizes that the game he thought he had mastered is now in Jasmine's hands. The game is no longer just about ego, but about justice, and the prosecutor is ready to lead the battle with intelligence and determination. A few weeks into this silent confrontation, Jasmine Carter decided it was time to take her message to the public. Richard Thompson, convinced he could continue operating in the shadows, was unaware that his machinations were now being closely monitored by the prosecutor. On the day of a hearing in a case in which Richard had attempted to influence the court through discreet contacts and pressure, Jasmine burst in with impeccable preparation. She had compiled all the evidence of his attempts at intimidation and manipulation. Her files were clear, precise, and indisputable. When the session began, Richard sat in the courtroom with a condescending smile, convinced that nothing she said would affect him. But he didn't know the extent of Jasmine's strategy. She stood and calmly presented the documents, communications, emails, and testimonies proving her actions against the prosecutor. Every word was carefully chosen, every piece of evidence presented with precision. The judge, as well as everyone else present, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Thompson," Jasmine said in a firm but calm voice, "you attempted to pervert the course of justice to protect your own image. These actions will not be ignored." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard's initially confident allies looked down, embarrassed and helpless. Richard, however, felt his arrogance crumble. For the first time in his life, he was publicly humiliated. Murmurs circulated around the room, and some of his firm's clients in the audience turned away, shocked by his revealed shenanigans. Jasmine had not only fought back, but had turned her defense into a masterful lesson. Richard's arrogance and racism could not survive truth and justice. As Jasmine left the hearing, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and determination. This was only one step in the battle, but she had clearly shown that she was fearless and willing to go to any lengths to defend her integrity and justice. Meanwhile, Richard returned to his office, pale and furious, aware that his comfortable world had just cracked. He understood that his position of power and influence was no longer sufficient to control what was happening. The chapter ends with this dramatic tension. Jasmine advances with confidence, while Richard, humiliated and destabilized, begins to understand that he could lose much more than his reputation. After the public humiliation in court, Richard Thompson was determined to regain control. His bruised ego and threatened sense of power drove him to act impulsively. He decided to launch a direct counterattack against Jasmine Carter, convinced he could trap her using his connections and influence in the city. He began contacting associates, seeking compromising information about Jasmine, hoping to unearth some scandal or misconduct that might discredit her. But Jasmine, anticipating that Richard would not relent, had taken extreme care to secure her communications and preserve her reputation. Everything he could uncover was perfectly legal and transparent. Richard, frustrated, then decided to take things further. He tried to influence Jasmine's business partners to create tension and delay her projects. He believed this would put pressure on her and force her to make a mistake. But Jasmine, thanks to her network and legal expertise, saw every move coming. She had identified the attempts at manipulation and had even prepared countermeasures. She decided not to retaliate immediately, but to let Richard exhaust himself in his schemes, while gathering evidence of his actions for future legal action. One morning, during a business meeting where Richard hoped to intimidate her, Jasmine entered calmly and confidently. She knew exactly what Richard was up to before he even said a word. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said with a polite but sharp smile. "I assume you've come to try to influence or pressure me again." "Unfortunately for you, I'm prepared." Richard felt his anger rising. He had planned to surprise Jasmine, but found himself caught in his own trap. Every move he made was anticipated, every attempt neutralized. For the first time, he felt real fear. His reputation and his power were at risk. The chapter ends with this tension. Richard, exhausted and frustrated, realizes he is no longer in control, while Jasmine, strategic and methodical, moves slowly but surely toward inevitable victory. The game is no longer just about personal confrontation, but about triumphant justice. After several weeks of tension and scheming, Jasmine Carter had finally gathered all the evidence she needed to confront Richard Thompson irreversibly. She knew the time had come to take public action, where he could no longer use his influence to evade the truth. Richard, convinced that his efforts to intimidate Jasmine would bear fruit, had organized a business conference where he planned to shine in public and demonstrate his power. But he didn't know that Jasmine had planned her retaliation exactly here, in front of everyone who respected him in the city. As the room filled with partners, clients, and journalists, Richard spoke with his trademark arrogant smile. He boasted of his success and influence, confident that no one would question his authority. Then Jasmine stood up. Calmly, with impeccable confidence, she walked towards the stage with a thick folder in her hand. All eyes turned towards her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and firm, "I must inform you of an attempt by Richard Thompson to intimidate and manipulate me and my office." She laid out the evidence, emails, witness statements, and documents showing how Richard had attempted to influence her cases, disrupt her work, and intimidate those around her. Every word was precise, and every piece of evidence was irrefutable. Silence fell over the room. Richard, stunned, felt his cheeks burn with shame. His allies looked down, his partners were shocked, and the reporters frantically took notes. The man who thought he controlled everyone had just seen his power crumble before the force of the truth. Jasmine concludes, "Justice cannot be influenced by money or power. Any attempt at manipulation will be prosecuted according to the law, and I will ensure that everyone witnesses it. At that moment, Richard realized his reputation, his control, and his arrogance had been completely exposed. He no longer had any way to defend himself. The prosecutor had confronted him with his own arrogance, and the city had just seen him for who he really was. The chapter ends with this striking contrast: Jasmine, motionless and triumphant, a symbol of justice and courage, and Richard, overwhelmed and humiliated, discovering how costly it can be to underestimate someone. After the public confrontation, Richard Thompson realized his downfall was inevitable. The evidence Jasmine Carter had accumulated left no escape. Business partners, journalists, and even his own employees began to doubt his integrity. Every scheme he had attempted was now known and documented. The next day, internal investigations were launched at his company. His actions, once shielded by his power and influence, were scrutinized. Executives and the board were shocked by the extent of his abuse of power and discriminatory behavior. Immediate sanctions were implemented, and Richard was placed on internal probation pending official findings. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued to receive praise for her courage and determination. Her colleagues and superiors commended her for her composure and strategy, noting that her response had not only been a personal lesson for Richard, but an example for the entire professional community. However, Jasmine didn't stop there. She ensured that all of Richard's illegal and discriminatory actions were brought before the appropriate authorities, ensuring that justice was done legally and irrevocably. Her actions were precise and methodical, with each step strengthening her position and the credibility of her accusations. Richard, isolated and humiliated, began to feel the weight of his mistakes. His reputation was severely damaged, and his personal and professional ambitions were cut short. He realized, too late, that his arrogance and racism had led to his own destruction. The chapter ends on a note of triumphant justice. Jasmine, strong and respected, had not only protected her career and dignity, but had also demonstrated that perseverance, intelligence, and courage can overthrow even the most powerful people. As for Richard, he now had to face the consequences of his actions, in indignity and isolation. A few weeks after the courtroom events and the public confrontation, Richard Thompson's situation had become critical. His attempts at intimidation and manipulation had been made public, and his actions were now being scrutinized by the courts and relevant authorities. His allies and business partners had gradually distanced themselves, no longer wanting to be associated with a discredited and humiliated man. Jasmine Carter, for her part, had consolidated her position. Her determination and professionalism had not only strengthened her reputation, but also sent a clear message: justice cannot be bought or intimidated. Her colleagues and superiors praised her for her strategic mastery, and her success in this case had become an example to the entire professional community. One morning, Richard was summoned to a final meeting with his company's board of directors. He knew the decision would be irreversible. The evidence Jasmine had accumulated and the internal investigations left no room for maneuver. The sentence was clear: Richard Thompson was suspended from all his duties and would face prosecution for his abuse of power and discriminatory tactics. Alone in his office, now devoid of any support, Richard realized the extent of his fall. The arrogance and hatred that had driven him had been his downfall. Every move, every decision, every scheme had been countered with intelligence and courage by Jasmine, transforming his defeat into a shining example of justice. For her part, Jasmine, serene but proud, continued her work with renewed energy. She knew that her victory was about more than Richard Thompson; it represented the strength of integrity, perseverance, and courage in the face of injustice. The city itself had witnessed the power of truth and the law, and for all who had doubted or suffered oppression, it had become a symbol of justice. The chapter and the story end with this image: Jasmine Carter walking confidently through the halls of the courtroom, respected and admired, while Richard Thompson, alone and discredited, finally understood that true power lies not in money or influence, but in justice and integrity.